Hey everyone, it's Michelle Vina-Baltsas. Thanks for tuning in. I wanted to do a video about a post that I had last week in the No Diet Sisterhood related to food addiction and whether or not you believe that food addiction was a true addiction or not. And as promised, I have done my homework and I have come up with some thoughts about this that I wanted to share with you because it's an important topic, and I appreciated that everybody took the time to make a comment, say yes or no, or put some other information. So based on the information that I was able to find, I am doing this short video. So as always, I ask that you keep your hearts and your mind open to the information that I'm providing here for you. And I will give you some references of the information that I studied to create this video, and also that I believe to be very, very valid resources for you to check out. So again, let's keep our hearts and our mind open to this, okay? And I will be looking at my notes a lot because I did take a lot of notes here, and I printed out a bunch of stuff for myself to read and to reference. Food addiction, is it fact or is it fiction? And that is what we're going to talk about here. First of all, based on everything that I read, it appears that the jury is still out on whether or not food is actually an addiction or not. Now, I am not saying that the way that you may feel around certain foods is not valid, because I understand what it's like to feel addicted to a particular food. For me, it used to be fried foods. For many other people, it's sugar. You know, refined sugar really triggers people and makes them want to eat more. So I'm not invalidating those feelings at all because I have experienced them myself. What I will say is that it's still not technically proven based on the research that I've done, and that the research is still in its infancy stages. And that's very important to understand because the information that is out there, there have been a couple of tests here and there, some research studies, but as I'm going to talk about, these research studies were limited, and I will tell you why in a few minutes. The other thing is that food addiction is not clearly defined yet, even in the research that has been done. So until it's clearly defined, I think it's a little bit difficult really to say whether this is fact or fiction. Some people believe in the industry, specifically in the no diet industry, that the talk about food addiction is really a lot of media hype. And you know, all of us have experienced, especially those of us who are really trying to get out of diet culture, that the media is constantly trying to find a new angle about some other type of food to demonize. So, you know, or to promote. Like, so for a while, as an example, it was kale, you know, and then there's a specific diet, a paleo diet, that's better than something else. Now it's ketogenic. So there's always something that related to food and body that the media is looking to get a new angle on, so that basically they can write new stories, generate more interest, and put more money back into the dieting industry. So that's very, very important. The other thing is that much of the research that I looked at really was focusing on the fact that talk about food addiction is oftentimes a very fear-based message. And that again goes back to a lot of the media messages that we see that are demonizing foods. You know, sugar is bad, this is bad, that's good. And you know, we're all familiar with that, so I'm not going to go through the whole mantra about that, but it's very important to understand the source of these messages and also understand what their motivation is for getting us to listen to them. Okay, because that's pretty much where the money is. So that's very, very important. So the fear-based message continues to remind people, especially people that are challenged by food or struggle with disordered eating, that they cannot be trusted around food. period. This is the message that we are always getting, and what the diet culture is always trying to promote, that we cannot be trusted around food. And that, so the whole addiction theory really feeds into that fear that, see, I can't have a piece of cake because when I do, I want to eat the whole cake. So I must be addicted. And that just continues to deteriorate any type of trust that you are trying to regain with your food. So those messages continue to chip away at that. And it just basically, again, reiterates the message that can't be trusted around food. See, and that's the proof. So, and also the message that when we eat, specific foods, especially foods that we enjoy eating, that not only do we not have any trust, but that we have no control at all. So that is another message that we continue to hear: no trust and no control. Not a good feeling for anyone. So again, they're targeting a very vulnerable population of people who generally struggle with disordered eating and have no trust in themselves around food. So when they continue to hear these messages, they're like, see, there it is again. And it's just another nail in the coffin for them. And they just continue to restrict foods because they are afraid. Sound familiar? I know it did for me for many, many years. And sometimes, believe me, I'm still tripped up by these messages and I still get afraid. And then I do like a little reality check, but it happens to everyone, so just understand that. So the other thing I want to mention is which I kind of mentioned a little bit or touched on, is to really look at the bigger picture here. And everything that I've read kept leading to the whole addiction theory is that it is leading more to disordered eating than anything else. And again, about that restriction and restraint around food is really, they're all symptomatic of disordered eating and not to addiction. Again, I'm not saying whether food addiction is real or not real. All I'm saying is to be open to the possibility that it is, that we need to look at that bigger picture. And there is evidence to corroborate that. So, related to the brain scans, or what are called neuroimaging, okay? I'm not a neurologist, but this word is thrown around all the time, brain scans, and how, when people eat certain foods, different pleasures, what they call pleasure centers of the brain light up. And the reality is that pleasure centers of our brain light up all the time. When a mother is with her baby, her pleasure centers in her brain light up. When we listen to music, when we laugh, things of that nature, all those things cause our brain pleasure centers to light up. So it's not just with food that happens, or with foods that are have a lot of refined sugar or things like that. So that's very, very important to understand. The imaging shows that the bigger the response in the brain, or the larger the light up center is, that is typically an indication that there has been some restraint there. So that's very, very important to understand, especially as it relates to food. There have been several studies about this. I'm sure there are more than several, but the ones that I looked at were specifically in the Intuitive Eating Workbook, which I posted about before. But on page 72 and 73, and if you don't have the book, don't worry about this, because I'm going to include screenshots of this in my link to the video, so you will be able to read them. But there are a couple of studies that are often referenced, and one is the YFAS, which is an acronym for the Yale Food Addiction Survey. And this survey is very, very important. And obviously Yale is a very prestigious university. I mean, you hear that, you're like, oh, well, that must be valid, And I'm not saying it's invalid. All I'm telling you is that based on what I've read, not just in the workbook, but also listening to a couple of podcasts related to food addiction, is that this survey did not account for restricting and dieting. So it did not take restriction into account when people were filling out their survey. And that is a critical piece to how people behave with food, as we well know, because the restriction often causes binging. Okay, so that's very, very important, and they came clean about that. Okay, so that's very important. The other thing is that there was some fasting that was done in another study at Princeton University, also a very prestigious university, and the testing was done on what they said sugar-addicted rats. And the outcome was that they were only able to get the results that they were looking for in terms of proving that these rats were addicted to sugar after they had a 12-hour starvation cycle before that. That's the only way that they were able to get these rats to show addictive behavior. Of course, we're humans, we're not rats, so that's inconclusive in terms of how humans may react, but it's very, very telling that restriction has a huge impact on the results that they're seeing in this testing. So again, I will absolutely include screen captures of what is in the Intuitive Eating Workbook for you, so you can read this for yourself. So what I want you to consider is that, restricting foods and having forbidden foods and things of that nature, people do that to protect themselves, basically, because they're afraid that they cannot be trusted with specific foods. And I totally get that, because again, I used to do it. So I lived it. I understand it. I used to have a fairly long list of forbidden foods. And when I was able to work with my coach, my intuitive eating coach, years ago, and to release the forbidden foods and take them off of my list, it was done in a very safe way. Janine Roth, I know, does some, she believes that, no food should be restricted, but she says, well, go and eat the foods. And I'm not criticizing Janine Roth, I'm just saying that this is a totally different way about going about it. And then people go and eat these foods that they feel that they have an addiction to, and they're out of control, and they say, I can't do this. I really am addicted. And that's one way to go about it. And usually it's not very successful, because people get so scared and freaked out that they believe what they have been told all this time, that they can handle these foods and that they shouldn't eat them. And what that does is it leads to further restriction. Okay, another way to do it is with a coach or a dietitian who is trained in intuitive eating, who can help you reintroduce these foods in a way that is safe and that doesn't have this rebound effect where you just go bananas crazy and eat everything in sight, which just makes your self-esteem plummet, and worse, makes you believe that you cannot handle these foods. I'm not saying that everybody can handle them, but I'm saying that in a controlled environment where you have the support that is necessary, many people, including myself and many of my clients, have been able to overcome, this feeling of food addiction. So it's definitely possible. So when you reintroduce foods in a balanced way, specifically the foods that you have been restricting for a long time, many times, again, when it's done safely in a balanced way, you are able to eat these foods again and enjoy them and have pleasure and not be like, oh my God, chips, or oh my God, bread or a bagel, get it, been there, done that. It's also important to be realistic and understand that these things take a little bit of time, and that you may need to continue to expose yourself to the food and get in a very controlled, supporting, and loving environment where somebody can really guide you through the process so that you know what to expect. And you don't just throw the water away with, the baby away with the bathwater, that it can be a very, very vulnerable and scary thing to do. And having that support in place so that you have an outcome that is desirable, as opposed to an outcome that's going to make you believe that you really can't do it. Because I believe that in most cases it can be done. Okay, so some very important questions to ask yourself if you believe that you do have an addiction to specific foods. And many say it's to refined sugar, but I'm sure people have other things that they feel they're addicted to also. Okay, so a couple of important questions to ask yourself. when does it happen? When do you feel that that this food calls you? Is it, under certain conditions? That's one thing. What happens before a specific binge? It could be what happens before a sugar binge. What is it that is there something that happens just before that? And that's important to ask yourself. Also, very, very important, what level of food restriction is happening in your life, okay? And really think carefully about that, because many people think that they're not restricting, but when they ask themselves that question, sometimes they get back a different answer than they were expecting. So that's very important. The other thing is, how long has this been going on? And that's also good to know. So those are very important things to ask yourself if you really feel that you're addicted to food. Again, based on everything that I read and listened to, these studies are in their infancy, and it's not proven one way or another. I know, there's a lot of very, very popular they say they're not dieting, but they kind of are, like sugar fix type doctors that believe that sugar addiction is real. And again, I'm not here to say whether it is or isn't. All I'm saying is to keep your mind open to the possibility that it could be a symptom of disordered eating, and that restriction is never the answer, which we talk about all the time, and I certainly preach about all the time in the group and in my writing and in my blogs and in whatever podcasts I do. So restriction always leads to binging eventually. It doesn't happen right away, but eventually it will yield a binge. And we really need to consider the behaviors here and not just the foods, because oftentimes when people really look at things, their binge or their food addiction type behaviors surface when something very emotional is happening in their lives, when they are emotionally triggered by something. And if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. In my opinion, it's never about the food. It's really about the emotions that drive us to the food, and it's also our fear of enjoying food too much because we're fearful of weight gain, because we're afraid we won't be able to handle it, because we don't trust ourselves around food. These are all symptoms of disordered eating. So I really hope that this video has been helpful for you. Like I said, I will there's a couple of different studies that I'm going to give you links to, so you can read up on them on your own and form your own opinion. And I'm also going to give you 2 screenshots of the what's in the Intuitive Eating Workbook, which is an excellent workbook that I highly recommend and have recommended in the group, the No Diet Sisterhood, several times. So again, I hope this was helpful. And that is all. Feel free to post any questions you have, bearing in mind that I did not do this research. I just read it and did my best to interpret it to the best of my ability. I think that the research I'm going to give you is very telling, and I hope that it helps you to think about food addiction and food trust and disordered eating in a different light. And that's all. So signing off, Michelle Vina-Baltsas, and I hope you're all doing well. Bye-bye.